paraphrasing a professor I had in college years ago, the U.S. Constitution is the worst frame of government ever devised, unless it's compared to all the rest. Many things about our Constitution, which is the second oldest extant Constitution in the world that merit continued study. And tonight what I want to do is tell you some of the things that I think mean a lot about the Constitution to us as a people. I want to start off, this talk is basically in two parts. I want to start off, part one is to take you a little bit through what the historians call historiography of the Constitution. What's sort of been the narrative of our Constitution from way back in the early days of the Republic. And then part two, I want to talk a little bit about what previous generations did not know and what we tend not to know. Okay, so those are the two parts of my talk tonight. Part one, about the historiography, the narratives of the Constitution. You know, the narrative that you adopt of the Constitution is very much like a Rorschach test. It tells you, it's like putting a mirror in front of you, and it tells you a lot about what you think of our country and what you think about yourself as a citizen. In the early days of the Republic, so when the framers of the Constitution are sort of dying off, this romantic era lionized the founders. And it was the great man theory. All of the people who framed the Constitution were great men. This is based on Carlyle's work, which was called the great man theory that he developed. And history was driven by great men, according to his theory. And you can see that in the writings. And Abraham Lincoln gives a very telling speech in 1838, in which he talks, his famous Lyceum speech, his most famous early speech, in which he talks about the ancient oaks. Now, you know, this is 1838. It's not that long before where you have the founders, a couple of them are still alive. But he talks about the ancient oaks who stood, you know, perennially. And the principles that they supported, that we lesser mortals, you know, would be happy just to get under the boughs of the oak trees, you know, and learn from them and take our rest from them, that kind of thing. And his view of his generation was that it was only a shadow of the founders. And he said, maybe we can learn as much as possible about the Constitution in case our generation ever happens to face some severe test. Well, you know what the test is going to be. 2.5 decades later, this is amazingly prescient. Then after the Civil War, there's a narrative about the Constitution which really emphasized not so much the great man, but the great nation. We were a nation, after 626,000 Americans, North and South, died, we were a nation desperately in need of healing. The narrative that was constructed about the Constitution at that point is that it helped found a great nation. A nation that, you know, instantiated these rights, ancient rights of natural law, the ancient rights of Englishmen that we were able to win in a revolution, because it turned out that really King George III was the revolutionary. He became a dictator and violated our ancient rights. And Americans, seeing the truth, seized those ancient rights. So George Washington is actually the conservative by this interpretation. And this was the era in which you walked into every American's home, and it was a picture of George Washington on the mantle or over the fireplace. About 1913, right on the eve of the First World War, the whole narrative of the Constitution dramatically changes. This is because there's been a very important movement in U.S. history called the Progressive Era. And in the Progressive Era, people were saying we need to progress beyond our understanding of the founding because of a huge fact in the world and in America. It's called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changes everything. And people are saying to themselves, and this is where the idea of an organic, a living Constitution arises, people are saying the founders got so much right, but they could not have anticipated this huge new force in our lives, and that's the Industrial Revolution, and the way it's disintegrated societies and reconstructed societies as people have had to move from the farm to these new cities. We didn't have cities like this in world history. Everything changes about American life as a result. So the progressive movement tries to cope with its interpretation of both what happened with industry, agriculture, and the Constitution. Charles Beard writes a book in 1913 about the economic history of the Constitution, which becomes a benchmark piece. Then by the time I go to school as an undergraduate in the 1970s, Charles Beard is overturned. Because historians were starting to say, the problem with Beard is that he focused too much on a kind of a quasi-Marxist view, kind of a focus on class conflict. Really what the Constitution was about, this is from the work of a guy named John J. A. Pocock, very, very famous historian, political theorist. It was about Republican institutions. Of course, I mean Republican, little r. If you go back to the ancient world and look at the civic Republican tradition of ancient Rome, and you look at how that civic Republican tradition was revived in the Italian Renaissance, in Venice and other city-states, that gave humans a new freedom, a new outlook on what it was to be a political animal. Very Aristotelian, really. And Pocock's work set the agenda. And this historian named Forrest McDonald, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he wrote 3 books about the Constitution in the 1970s and early 80s. He emphasized this is what the founders were about. It's not class interests. It's not lionizing the founders. It's not just healing the wounds of a civil war. A much more important agenda is what is a republic in a world of hostile monarchies where you don't have that much freedom. Now that narrative was largely overthrown in the last 10 or 12 years or so, which has, these things happen, every generation or so. The narrative that is now afoot is very much one that looks at the flaws of the founders. And if you go to the President's house in Philadelphia, right off the Liberty Bell, right off Constitution at the mall there, how many of you have been to the President's house in Philadelphia? Okay. Mike and a couple of others. That emphasizes that George Washington, who lived in, you remember Philadelphia was our second national capital. New York was first, and Philadelphia for 10 years between 1790 and 1800. Then it moves to Washington, D.C. George Washington is the inhabitant of that house, and the emphasis of the narrative in that house is that George Washington and Martha had 9 slaves. But Ona Judge and Hercules were 2 slaves in that house that escaped. And the narrative in that house is that Washington used the power of the federal government to recover his personal property. And it raises a number of interesting ethical questions, and it reminds us that these people lived in a time in which they were conditioned by the social habits, and they were also limited by the historical possibilities. Slave holding, of course, was the great stain on our country's history at this time. But that's the narrative that prevails now. Now, I'm saying, whatever narrative you attach to tells you a lot about your thoughts about our Constitution and this country and your role as a citizen in it. Now, there are things that previous generations didn't know much about. As I've suggested, previous generations did not know about the flaws of our founders to the extent we do. And I know when I go out and give talks at Ollie over at Aquinas or give other public talks, audiences now, they love to hear this. It's sort of the old theory, if you have something bad to say about somebody, come sit by me. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, famous saying. And so we know now, historians have uncovered and openly written about all kinds of flaws of these very interesting giants. We know that some of them had illegitimate children, Ben Franklin. We know that some of them were quite promiscuous. Alexander Hamilton, when he was Secretary of the Treasury, also Benjamin Franklin. We know Gouverneur Morris, for example, got his peg leg. Y'all know this story? Gouverneur Morris, who looked like a pirate, who was at the Constitutional Convention. How did he get his peg leg? Because he was fleeing out of a window when hubby comes home. So he's leaving his mistress and he's running to the carriage, and then the carriage runs over his leg and he loses his leg. So he carries his mistake physically for the rest of his life. He looked like a pirate at the Constitutional Convention. Gouverneur Morris. We're going to talk about Goo a little bit later. Remarkable mind. He's the stylist behind the Constitution. And then we have other interesting characters in the pantheon. I can't go through all of them, but they're just, it's a fascinating, some of them are too irascible to get along with. Truly just mean-spirited characters. We know that also, for example, the fights that would develop between them, we know that they would get very nasty at times. I would like to read something that actually I'd forgotten that I had put in a postcard a couple of years ago. But they could be so testy with one another. There comes a point in the Constitutional Convention where Benjamin Franklin, he's really tired of all the bickering. And he's looking at the Southern delegates who are threatening to get out of the convention over the issue of slavery because they don't feel they're getting the respect from the Northern delegates that's needed to preserve, to protect property, peculiar institution. And Franklin says, well, maybe this is a good time to pray. It's like deist. And he's saying, maybe this is a good time to pray. To which Hamilton snapped, this is no time for foreign aid. That hot summer in Philadelphia when all the windows are nailed shut so the press, the newspaper men, cannot hear what's going on. They were testy. And they argued with each other. And how many of you have seen the HBO John Adams? Even the first couple of hours of that give you a great illustration of how testy they were with each other and how they practically came to fisticuffs on a number of examples. One of the interns I was working with today asked me if he should file his postcard, and I was about to give him an absent-minded answer, and I looked at it and I thought, I'm going to be talking about Washington tonight. And I'd forgotten that I had written this for when we had a speaker here in 2011 on this very stage. This is what I borrowed from a book about Ron Chernow's book on Washington, about George Washington. Listen to this. Colonel George Washington of the Virginia militia, seeking to terrify his untutored, undisciplined, ragamuffin soldiers into obedience, built a 40-foot-high gibbet. Soon after, he sentences 14 of his men to death for desertion and insubordination. Though he will eventually spare 12 from the noose, he will still punish them with absolute, fierce, and shocking floggings, an average of 600 lashes per prisoner. Now, that sounds like it's too many, but Ron, as you know, he details these things very meticulously. Ron Chernow says that Washington did that to deter others. It is an expression of his blazing temper. He had a fierce temper. It is also a result of his experience as an explorer and soldier in the Virginia wilderness, which darkened his view of human nature. His lifelong practice will be to see people as motivated more by force than kindness. This is the father of our country. The generations lionized. This is not what previous generations knew about Washington. Oh, yes, they had the cute stories about the cherry tree, which, of course, were totally ridiculous and apocryphal, but the substantive stories they did not have. And it's telling now what we do say about our founders. So if previous generations did not have a very good grasp of, these people, sometimes historians like to say they're in the age of marble, because we lionized all these people. We see them, warts and all. And people ask me, Gleaves, you admire the founders so much. Why do you emphasize this in your talks about them and talk about all their flaws? My answer is always, when I go into a classroom, I want students to appreciate the great work that the founders did, but I don't want them to feel that they're so perfect that everything that we would do, that their generation would do, would fall short. It would make them too inaccessible. If we show them in all of their flaws, then the founders are accessible to us because of their hot tempers and their indiscretions and all the mistakes they made in their lives. And so students today can hear that and they say, okay, I don't have to be perfect. That doesn't let me off the hook. I still have an obligation to do the best I can. So that's why I talk about what previous generations did not know. What are we tending to forget? We're forgetting a lot, as that survey suggests. And I know from the classroom, we're forgetting a lot. a lot of my students don't know basically how the Constitution is structured or what's in it. But I think we are forgetting some amazing lessons in political philosophy. We're forgetting how smart these folks were. We're forgetting how prudent they could be and how they conceived of what a republic should be. Let's look, for example, at how they leveraged their experience. There were no fewer than 8 attempts of the colonial generation and the early founders of our country to try to unify the United States, those 13 colonies and then states, into a unified country. Starting with the Albany Plan, Franklin, 1755, and going up to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Every attempt failed in some major way, had a big flaw in it. So our founders were learning along the way. In fact, historians really write there were 2 generations of founders, and thank goodness the second generation of founders learned from the first generation about the mistakes. And sometimes we overlook the good things that our first Constitution provided for. Our first Constitution, of course, the Articles of Confederation. Look at what Americans did under the Articles of Confederation before we jumped to the Constitutional Convention. Americans under the Articles won a war against the superpower of the world in its day, Great Britain. Won a war. Also through the Northwest Ordinance, which we are familiar with in Michigan, and which is incorporated in Article 3 of our state constitution. That's the article that says religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be provided. The words lifted right out of the Northwest Ordinance, which is, of course, set up by the Articles. We laid out a way to settle the West in township and range in an orderly way. We had such a population surge to the West, to this part of the world, once this area was opened up. And Jefferson and the others had the wisdom to see how it would take place so that there'd be ordered freedom, and not just chaos. So, we won a war, a major war. We settled the West. And structurally, already the Articles were determined to make sure that any accretions of territory, any new republics, states that were formed, would be equal to the already existing republics. Why is that important? Because that would avert future civil wars. If you had inferior republics, you could have all kinds of problems. This is what contributed to Rome's troubles, for example, as an ancient republic. Our founders read history and they learned the lessons of history wherever they could. So we really need to tip our hat to the previous attempts to try to settle this country and unify it in a way before a constitution comes along. It's because of the failures. This is, we talk about leadership all the time. People who talk about leadership always want to emphasize it's the mistakes. That, this is why there should be failure labs for the training of leaders. What do we learn from our mistakes? Because then that really does leverage into a much more successful end product. That's why the Constitution that we do have today is so much better than the previous half-dozen attempts to unify those 13 colonies in the states. So that's important. They're prudence. The second thing I would say that we have forgotten is how doggone smart these people were. We know that the brilliance of a Hamilton, of a Jefferson, of an Adams, and by the way, of course, Jefferson and Adams were not even at the Constitutional Convention. Can you imagine playing that game and benching or sending elsewhere, your star quarterback and running back? I mean, it's like Jefferson and Adams aren't even there in Philadelphia in 1787. But they both had written works that were to influence Madison and the other founders, the framers of the Constitution. Adams had written the oldest extant Constitution in the world. The Constitution he wrote for Massachusetts in 1780 is the oldest Constitution. Adams had written books surrounding the creation of that document and left us a wonderful legacy that the founders, the framers, could draw on in the creation of our current Constitution. So that's an important lesson as well. If you look at, I told you we'd come back to Gouverneur Morris, because if you look at what Gouverneur Morris actually writes. He's the author of the Preamble. He's the stylist of the Preamble. And if you look at what he writes in the Preamble, it is remarkable. 52 words, which comprise one of the most sublime lessons in political philosophy you would ever have. Now, did everybody pick up a pocket constitution on the way in? They're out on the table there. I hope most of you have. I'd just like to go through this preamble. It's the only closed textual reading we'll do today for this class. But what I'd like to do is go through it and explain the rationale. Because it's not a random ordering of syntax. We, the people of the United States, in order to. Now, this is an infinitive phrase. And we're going to have 6 purposes of government here. What I want you to pay attention to is the order of these 6 little phrases, these little prepositional phrases. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And it goes on, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Those 6 phrases are put in a very specific order to teach us about the preconditions of liberty. All of those, the previous 5, before the word liberty is even mentioned, there are 5 other things that are talked about. And you absolutely have to have the first 5 in place before liberty can be secured and is meaningful. We've forgotten this as a people. Let's go through it real fast. To form a more perfect union. You know, if you don't have a line drawn on a map, if you don't say, this is our jurisdiction, this is what we're talking about, you can't have a more perfect union. You have to know what geographic area, what historically cultural, vibrant area you're talking about within those boundaries. For that to make any sense. To form a more perfect union, you've got to say, this is our community. Here's who it is. Just exactly what Herodotus did with the ancient Greeks when he said, these are the Greeks, these are the barbarians. This is the United States of America. This is our community. So you define that community first. What comes after defining a community? Establishing justice. Because if you don't have justice, everything afterwards will collapse. You have to have a justice system that's based either on predictable common law, natural law, Roman law, the Code of Justinian, whatever you want it to be, but you have to have a predictable system of justice that people can count on, a way to redress grievances. Ensure domestic tranquility. You have to make sure that the people in that community who are enjoying justice now can act on the fruits of whatever industry they want to apply themselves to. They have domestic tranquility. They can go to work in the morning. They can school their kids. They can recreate, you name it. But they have to have domestic tranquility and then provide for the common defense. You have to make sure your borders are secure. You have to make sure there are no threats out there. I love Chief Justice Tom Brennan's formulation at this point. He said, in fact, let me quote it. It's a good line. Michigan Chief Justice Tom Brennan said, a nation that is not unified cannot be defended. A nation that is not just should not be defended. A nation that is not at peace with itself will not be defended. And Tom always said, look at South Vietnam. South Vietnam illustrates. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we cannot, as a country, put this in a FedEx envelope, mail it to a foreign country, and just expect it to take root. That is a flawed foreign policy. Thank you. It doesn't work that way. I promise you I will not be partisan. Then, after the common defense, the 5th purpose of government that Gouverneur Morris writes about in the Preamble is promoting the general welfare. Now think about what that means. It means nothing at all like what welfare has become in the 20th century since, say, the New Deal and the Great Society. The general welfare at the time the document was framed had to do with the infrastructure that you promote in a society. This is going to remind you of a debate between Romney and Obama. But it's right here in the preamble. The framers did say that the infrastructure matters. Are the roads clear? Are they good? Are the canals good? Are the ferry boats? If you go back and read the actual bills, the laws of the early Congress, is there a dependable ferry service across the Potomac or the Rappahannock? Those are the kinds of things you need to promote the general welfare, and that's why Congress is given certain powers to promote the welfare in helping build up the infrastructure that businesses will use. Okay? So there's a symbiotic relationship between the welfare as expressed in that infrastructure and the free enterprise that our founders believed in. Okay? I always point out to students that, who challenge me a little bit on this about what welfare means in this context. Look at the people who came to the United States in the 1780s and afterwards. These were the rejects of Europe. The first sons were given to the church often. The second sons were given to the army. The third sons would have their landed estates, with the aristocracy. The children at the end of the line, the people who didn't have much in the first place, America really was a refuge. All of that stuff from John Winthrop forward to Ronald Reagan about a shining city on a hill. It's true. America, if you read the writings, provided this place for all the people who, in a system where there was entail, for example, with tremendous restrictions on the passing down of property from one generation to the next. Here it was wide open. Talk about blue sky, blue ocean thinking. It was wide open socially, if you could get here. And in fact, if you go to Ellis Island, you learn that when people came over on the boats, basically, until the 1840s, there were no restrictions. And by the 1840s, 1850s, they're only checking you out to make sure you don't have diseases. You get here and you make it on your own. And that's the general welfare. Will you now, by whatever ways you can strap your way to the top, will you be able to use the infrastructure of roads, canals, bridges, our communications, and the postal service to build something here, a family, a way of life, a career, a job? That's the general welfare. And then last but not least, but notice it is last, the word liberty. And it's not even the main object there. It's the object of a prepositional phrase. The blessings of liberty. Blessings is really the emphasis there. What is going on there with that syntax? Well, we don't have time to go through the entire syntax and unpack it. I did write an article about this that I referred you to, about what is going on syntactically there. But the point is, Gouverneur Morris puts it at the very end of the 6 purposes of government as a way perpetually to remind Americans that these other conditions, the other 5, have to be in place and in a logical order, or some semblance of a logical order, to secure liberty. We don't start with liberty. That's the lesson. We don't start with liberty. If you try to start with liberty, the founders warned that it ends up either degenerating into anarchy politically or licentiousness morally. So that's why you need curves. Remember that dark view of human nature I just shared with you about Washington, turns out Adams, Hamilton. All of them have this darker view of human nature that we tend to forget. And they're marrying the civic republican tradition that I mentioned earlier that goes all the way back to ancient Rome, that emphasizes duties. These are our duties to one another. As a political, as a communal people, this is what we owe to each other. They marry that tradition from all the way back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece with a natural rights tradition that comes out of the Middle Ages, which emphasizes rights. I have natural rights by virtue of being a human being. And however you define your creator, whether out of nature or out of the divine, we are with these rights that must be respected by government because government does not create the right. It protects the right. That's what's made so plain in the Declaration of Independence. The founders wanted to marry these two traditions of rights and duties. And they said that's how we as Americans would have the best chance of being happy, of having an integrated civic life, and a life that's also integrated in our public and private spheres by marrying these two great traditions. Huge. We forget that. Who talks about the happiness of Americans as a people anymore? I would suggest we would benefit if we recovered an understanding of that. The second and very last part of their wisdom that I'd like to talk about, although we could go on all night about these things, but I want to talk about how they were able to reach across the proverbial aisle and work together. This to me is so important, a lesson today. A little teaser that I wrote up for the postcard and the advertisements that you would have gotten for this talk. I emphasize, you think politics is nasty nowadays. Ladies and gentlemen, it was nastier back in, if you look at the election of 1800, if you look at, Adams and Jefferson are running against each other, and, Jefferson basically is saying Adams is pimping in the White House, and Adams is saying Jefferson, slept with his slave and would make us an atheist country and that kind of thing. The vitriol in 1800 makes what you're seeing today on MSNBC or Fox look pretty tame. I kid you not. Pretty tame today. It's the wonderful thing about being a historian. It puts these things in perspective. The election of 1828, Andrew Jackson, he wins. His wife is so heartbroken by all of the criticism of her personal virtue. It so happened she was married to two men at the same time. Or Rachel. Misunderstood, but it was because the cad left. All indications were he had divorced her, but technically he had not. And so everybody dumped on Rachel's virtue, saying she really wasn't a virtuous woman. She died, I'm convinced, of a broken heart before she even gets to the White House. Elections in the past, trust me, were much worse. They're kind of like that chase out there. I'm thinking 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party, the so-called Ivy League election when you have, Taft, Wilson, and Roosevelt. Much worse, much more vitriol than you see today. And yet, this is my point, these folks found a way to work with each other. They reached past their regional interests and things that divided them regionally, and all their nasty dispositional issues they had. And look at that Constitutional Convention as it makes its way from the Virginia Plan to a New Jersey Plan, a Virginia Plan for the big states, and the New Jersey Plan for the small states, and then Roger Sherman's Connecticut Compromise. Brings these two fiercely opposed factions together. And then once they get that settled, all the debates over what to do with slavery, the stain on the American Republic. When several times, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, several times the South almost walked away. And yet, wiser heads prevailed. They worked together, and they gave us an incredible instrument of governance that has made us the freest, the most prosperous people on earth. So the lesson there is clear. Let me be a little political. Let me equally offend both sides. This is what I've been telling my students in the Leadership Academy this year. I think the easiest thing in the world, when you're in pitched battle politically, if you're a Democrat, to run over to the DNC and get your talking points from the DNC. If you're a Republican, run over to the RNC and get your talking points from the RNC. Yes, you can lead from that position. But how much better if your leadership takes the next stage, makes the next effort to try to build some bridge with the people with whom you disagree. That's what the founders did. Their RNC and DNC were called Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and then Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The party of Hamilton and Adams on the one hand and Jefferson on the other. They hated each other, and yet somehow they knew how to work together. That's what we have forgotten, how they worked together. And there are some lessons from the founding that I think we need desperately today. And you don't need me to stand on a pulpit now and say, I think everyone in this room knows it. But those are the lessons that I think would take us much farther, where we find some common ground. I call it finding that common ground. And here's how you do it. This is how they did it. They both define their traditions. They define their traditions with intellectual gravitas. But you know what? You go deep enough in your traditions, and you hit a common reservoir, an aquifer down below all of the flotsam of today's policy disputes and the principles that you're ad hocing to kind of justify your policy disputes. If you go deep enough in your tradition, you will find that common aquifer with people with whom you disagree. And if you go back to that, this requires an exercise in the historical imagination. But you go back to that, you will find common ground. And you remind yourselves of the purposes of our civic life together and what we're trying to do. And the purposes of government, as Gouverneur Morris explained it in those 52 words in the Preamble of the Constitution. Thank you very much. Time for just a couple of questions. Yes, sir.
Do you think they were able to build a common ground with the more easily than we can today because they shared the worldview in the way in which countries divided today?
You see, I think they were even more diverse than that. I think Jefferson, and now they evolved, so I'm going to make some gross generalizations. Please forgive me. But Jefferson and Franklin, they're deists. In fact, if you look at the founders, if you look at the key founders, what are the Adamses? They're Unitarians. What does that mean? They're not Trinitarians. So you have deists, you have Unitarians who would not say that Christ is divine. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. And it's true they had a respect for the culture, if that's your question. If there's a respect for the culture, that the tolerance that comes out of the Judeo-Christian worldview, respect for the individual, because the individual soul, we are homo viator, we are pilgrims on a spiritual search, and some are Jewish, some are Catholic, Orthodox. Of course, most Americans then were Protestant, but the founders did not necessarily reflect mainstream Protestant public opinion. So I don't think that that's the key. Yeah.
Really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. It's a bit of a question as to whether Unitarianism and deism is part of Orthodox Christianity. It's a question. The heart of today will be one God. So we find one God. And I think in the pluralism of postmodernism, you don't necessarily get that. But I'm wondering, where you very helpfully pointed out that hidden reservoir, I'm wondering whether that is the reservoir.
It's part of the reservoir. The reservoir I think they really drew from, though, and it was definitely part of the reservoir. In fact, a good friend of mine, Don Luntz, down at the University of Houston, has done some excellent research. So has Forrest McDonald. If you look at the language and unpack the words that are used in the tracts of the founders, the most quoted, passages do come from the Bible. There's a passage from First Chronicles that appears more than any other passage. So I should not minimize it. And you're onto something. But you know what? As I read the founders, and if I look at their long discourses and their developed arguments, what they're really drawing from, I think, is more the Greco-Roman tradition and then the Renaissance tradition out of it. I get the sense, and it's just sort of balancing it in the scales. Both need each other, both traditions, the Judeo-Christian and the Greco-Roman in our civilization. That's an important balance and principle. But the founders, being people of the British Enlightenment, tended to privilege or emphasize that Greco-Roman strain. That's why I mentioned the civic republican tradition. It's essentially pagan and looks at Aristotle and looks at Cicero. All of our founders, look at the pseudonyms they use. They don't use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, St. Stephen. Who are the synonyms, or the pseudonyms that are used? The noms de plume of our founders are Publius. Publius is at the end of every one of the 85 Federalist Papers. Every one of them. Who was he? He was the hero who helped found and then save the Roman Republic. Cincinnatus. Who is he? Washington was called the American Cincinnatus. Another early founder of the Republic of Rome. Cato the Younger. Washington's favorite play. Washington's favorite past narrative was Cato the Younger. And by Addison. From Cato, he learned what a Republican was. Adams and Jefferson, the two most prominent attorneys of the American Revolution, they identified mostly with Cicero, the greatest attorney of the ancient world, and the inventor, by the way, of the detective story. Because Cicero, in constructing his cases and being a brilliant orator before juries, would construct his case as though it were a detective story. So you're right. To be a responsible historian and student of American history, you have to look at both traditions. But the founders themselves, I'm very straightforward in this way. I'm not looking for any hidden code here. I think they privilege very greatly the Greco-Roman. And I think that's the common stream that's revived out of the Renaissance. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Great. Yes.
For the statistic that you gave out at the beginning of the lecture about the politicians and
Yes.
where's source behind that?
Yes. The article I have is NBC News. You just type in NBC News, and it's Constitution Quiz. And then go to isi.org and take the 33-question quiz yourself. Now that you've heard this lecture, you'll score 100%. Okay, one more question. Let's ask somebody from a different part of the room. Yes, back there in the back. Oh, you put your hand down. Bill.
What percentage of them were classically educated, and what percentage were more or less self-taught of the founders?
That's a great question. I like to point out that most of the founders were homeschooled. And so it was real rough and tumble in that environment. Sometimes the homeschooling was very classical. For example, Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter, made sure that great tutors were coming in to tend to his son's education. Then he goes off to William and Mary at the age of, 14 or 15. Brilliant student at William and Mary. And studies under George Wythe to become a lawyer. So the way we became lawyers in those days. Very much tutorial system. John Adams goes to Harvard. Has a very precocious son, but as David McCullough points out in his brilliant biography on John Adams, Adams comes from very, very humble background. He marries up when he marries Abigail, by the way. Abigail, I gotta say, Abigail was classically trained. She read every book in her father's library. He was a pastor. I've always maintained, if you go back and read the letters, the 1,750 letters between Abigail and John Adams, they are a treasure. There's nothing like them in world history. Abigail is every bit the equal of John. If she had been in a world like ours today, where she had had opportunities also to go to Harvard, as her husband did, and to serve in public, she would have eclipsed her husband. She was a brilliant woman and had a command of foreign languages, political theory, history, knew her history, wonderful one, and did all of this while raising a big family. And she's a remarkable human being. So it's all over the place, their education. I will say this, the president of the Constitutional Convention, George Washington, always rued the fact that he did not have a classical education. He just picked up knowledge in drips and drabs and always felt a little insecure as a result of that. He envied those who did have a classical education. John Adams said we had to fight the revolution so that while his generation had to do the fighting, his children's generation and his grandchildren's generation could major in the liberal arts and get that classical education. That's the way they viewed it. They put a premium on education. And I wish we did too. Thank you very much.